The roar of the crowd was deafening as Inter Miami scored their second goal. I sat in the corporate box at DRVPN Stadium watching Damon Kittredge pump his fist in celebration. My boss looked genuinely happy for the first time in months. "Great game, right, Camille?" he shouted over the noise, offering me another beer. I nodded, still buzzing from our recent project win. Svant Technologies had just secured a massive government contract worth $62 million. The software I had built from scratch was finally getting the recognition it deserved. At halftime, Damon suggested we grab coffee from the concession stand. The crowds were thick, but we found a quiet spot near the premium food court. That's when his whole demeanor changed. "Listen, Camille," he said, his voice suddenly flat and businesslike. "The board thinks we need someone with more grit for your position. It's not personal, just business." My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. "What do you mean?" "You're being let go. Today's your last day." The stadium noise faded to a dull buzz. "But I built the entire system they're profiting from." Damon smiled, that cold corporate smile I'd grown to hate. "That's exactly why we brought you to the game. Consider this your send-off." I stared at him for a long moment, processing what had just happened. Around us, families laughed and children cheered for their team. The smell of hot dogs and popcorn filled the air. Everything felt surreal. "I see," I said quietly, setting down my coffee cup. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I didn't cause a scene like every fiber of my being wanted to. Instead, I picked up my purse, thanked him for the lovely game, and walked toward the exit. My hands shook as I fumbled for my car keys in the parking lot. The security badge I'd worn every day for 4 years suddenly felt heavy in my pocket. By the time I reached my Honda Civic, my phone was already buzzing with notifications. The first message was from IT: "Your access has been revoked effective immediately." The second was from HR: "Please return all company property by Monday." They hadn't even waited for me to get home. While I was still walking through the stadium parking lot, they were already erasing me from their systems. The efficiency was brutal and impressive. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, watching other fans stream toward their vehicles, their faces bright with excitement from the game. My apartment felt like a tomb when I got home. The silence pressed against my ears after hours of stadium noise. I walked through each room mechanically, straightening pillows that didn't need straightening, washing dishes that were already clean. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. I'd poured 4 years of my life into Svanta Technologies, 60-hour weeks, weekend coding sessions, missing family dinners and friends' birthdays. All for what? To be fired at a soccer game like some kind of twisted corporate tradition. As I organized my already organized kitchen, memories flooded back. My first day at Svanta, when Benedict Rohr had personally welcomed me to the team. He was nothing like the corporate sharks who ran the company now. Benedict actually cared about the technology, about building something meaningful. He'd hired me straight out of graduate school, seeing potential in my thesis on adaptive security frameworks. "You're going to revolutionize how we think about software architecture," he told me that first day. Benedict had been right. The system I built became the backbone of everything Svanta did. And now they'd thrown me away like yesterday's newspaper. I collapsed on my couch, still wearing my stadium clothes, and stared at the ceiling until dawn. 3 days passed in a blur of cleaning, pacing, and sleepless nights. I'd reorganized my entire apartment twice. My friends kept calling, but I couldn't bring myself to explain what had happened. The humiliation burned too deeply. On Thursday morning, I finally opened my laptop. Not my work laptop, they demanded that back immediately, but my personal one. The old Dell I'd used in graduate school, covered in faded stickers from conferences and coding boot camps. Buried in a folder I hadn't touched in months, I found a file labeled Bralin Instructions. My heart stopped. Br. Benedict Rohr. I'd completely forgotten about this encrypted file. Benedict had given it to me just weeks before his cancer diagnosis, telling me to keep it safe just in case. I'd assumed it was some kind of emergency contact list or personal documents. My fingers trembled as I entered the password he'd whispered to me that day, Phoenix 2019. The file opened to reveal a legal document, signed and notarized. As I read the dense legal language, my breathing became shallow. Benedict had given me something impossible, something that could change everything. The document was a software ownership agreement. Not just any agreement, one that granted me permanent, irrevocable root access to the foundational code of every system I developed at Svanta. According to the legal text, Benedict had structured my employment contract differently than anyone else's. While the company owned the final products, I retained something called architectural stewardship rights over the core framework. It was brilliant and completely legal. Benedict had basically given me a master key to my own creation, disguised within legitimate corporate paperwork. The document was countersigned by 3 lawyers and filed with the state. There was also a personal letter. Camille, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong. I fear the board will eventually prioritize profit over people. This company was built on innovation, not exploitation. If they ever betray the values we shared, you have the power to protect what we built together. Use this wisely. Benedict. My hands shook as I reread the letter. Benedict had died 3 years ago, but he'd somehow anticipated exactly what would happen to me. I closed the laptop and walked to my window, staring out at the city skyline. Somewhere out there, Damon was probably celebrating his decision to fire me. He had no idea what Benedict had given me. For 2 weeks, I did nothing. I jogged every morning, read books I'd been meaning to finish, and tried to convince myself that moving on was the mature thing to do. I applied to a few jobs half-heartedly, knowing my heart wasn't in it. But at night, Benedict's letter haunted me. If they ever betray the values we shared, you have the power to protect what we built together. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I opened my laptop and began tracing through Svanta's system architecture, using my legitimate access credentials, the ones Benedict's document guaranteed me. I explored the codebase I'd built. What I found made me sick to my stomach. Damon's team had already started modifying my work, stripping out the elegant error-handling routines I'd spent months perfecting. They were cutting corners, introducing security vulnerabilities, all to rush new features to market. They were destroying everything I'd carefully crafted. Worse, I discovered they tried to remove my name from the source code comments, replacing them with generic, Svanta Engineering Team, credits. They were erasing my existence from my own creation. I spent hours documenting every change they'd made, every shortcut they'd taken. By 3 a.m., I'd made my decision. If they wanted to betray Benedict's values, fine. But they'd do it without my foundation to build on. At 4:02 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, I logged into Svanta's servers one final time. The office building was dark and empty. The night security guard was probably doing his rounds on the lower floors, unaware that their entire business model was about to change. I navigated to the core directory structure. My foundational framework sat there like the root system of a massive tree, invisible to most users, but essential for everything else to function. I didn't touch user data. I didn't delete client files or violate any privacy agreements. I was careful to avoid anything that could be considered sabotage or theft. Instead, I simply removed my architectural framework, the code I'd written during those long nights and weekend sessions, the elegant algorithms that made everything else possible, the security protocols that kept their clients' data safe. It was all mine, according to Benedict's document. And now, I was taking it back. The deletion took exactly 17 minutes. When it finished, I ran a secure wipe protocol to ensure the code couldn't be recovered from backup fragments. Then I closed the laptop, walked to my kitchen, and made coffee. Outside my window, The sun was starting to rise over a city that had no idea what had just happened. Svant Technologies would discover the problem in approximately 4 hours, when their first automated systems tried to run the morning security checks that I spent that morning packing 2 suitcases, my passport, and my laptop. I'd booked a flight to Auckland, New Zealand, leaving that evening. I'd always wanted to hike the Tanjero crossing and now seemed like the perfect time. My phone rang constantly, first my landlord, then my mother, then old colleagues from Salvanta. I ignored them all. At 2:47 p.m., my phone buzzed with a news alert: major software outage affects government contractor. I smiled grimly and turned off the phone. The Uber ride to the airport was peaceful. Miami's skyline disappeared behind me as we drove toward my new life. Whatever happened next, I was done being treated like disposable property. The plane lifted off just as the sun was setting. As we climbed above the clouds, I wondered what Damon was doing right now, probably screaming at some poor engineer, demanding they fix something that couldn't be fixed. The flight attendant offered me a drink. I ordered a ginger ale and opened a book about New Zealand hiking trails. Somewhere below us, Salvanta Technologies was discovering exactly how much their replaceable employee had actually been worth. But that was their problem now. I was going to walk across a volcano and figure out what came next. The Tanjero crossing was everything I'd hoped for: 19 kilometers of otherworldly landscape with steaming volcanic vents and emerald lakes that looked like something from a fantasy movie. Each step helped clear my mind of corporate politics and betrayal. On my 3rd day in New Zealand, I checked the news for the first time since landing. Salvanta Technology stock plummets after system failure. The article was brutal. Their biggest client, a defense contractor, was threatening to sue for breach of contract. 3 smaller clients had already terminated their agreements. The technical details made me wince. Salvanta's emergency team had tried to rebuild my framework from scratch, but they clearly didn't understand how the pieces fit together. Their hasty patches were causing cascade failures throughout the entire system. An analyst quoted in the article said, "It's like someone removed the foundation of a skyscraper and expected the building to stay standing." That was actually a pretty accurate metaphor. I closed my laptop and looked out at Lake Taupo. The water was impossibly blue, surrounded by mountains that had been formed by ancient volcanic eruptions. There was something poetic about sitting in a place shaped by creative destruction while reading about the chaos I'd left behind. My phone had 17 missed calls from Damon. A week later, I was in Morocco, surfing near Tagazout. The waves were perfect and the local surf culture was welcoming to solo travelers. I'd rented a small apartment overlooking the ocean and was learning to live without checking work emails every 5 minutes. The international news still followed Svant's implosion. Their stock had lost 60% of its value. The board had hired 3 different consulting firms to diagnose the system failure, but none could explain how such comprehensive damage had occurred without any signs of external hacking. One cybersecurity expert was quoted saying, "This appears to be an inside job, but we can't find any evidence of malicious access. It's like the code just vanished." I spent my mornings surfing and my afternoons reading technical journals, not because I had to, but because I genuinely missed the intellectual challenge of complex problem solving. One evening, while sketching system diagrams in a cafe, I realized something important: I wasn't done building. I was just done building for people who didn't appreciate the craft. I opened my laptop and started coding something new, something cleaner and more elegant than anything I'd built at Salvanta. I called it Onimo, after the Greek word for wind. Like wind, it would be invisible but powerful. And unlike my previous work, this would be mine from the beginning. After 2 months abroad, I flew back to the United States, not to Miami, that chapter was closed, but to Vermont. I'd always loved New England autumns, and Burlington felt like the perfect place for a fresh start. I bought a small cabin outside the city, surrounded by maple trees that were just beginning to turn red and gold. The property came with a converted barn that would make an excellent workshop. While I settled into my new home, Salvanta continued its downward spiral. They'd managed to rebuild basic functionality, but their patched system was slow, buggy, and expensive to maintain. Industry publications were calling it a cautionary tale about technical debt. Damon had been quietly removed as CTO. The official statement said he was pursuing other opportunities, but everyone knew he'd been fired. I felt a small surge of satisfaction reading that news. I spent my days setting up my workshop and my evenings refining Onimo. The framework was taking shape beautifully, everything I'd learned from 4 years at Salvanta, but without the corporate compromises and rushed deadlines. After 6 weeks in Vermont, I incorporated North Leaf Systems LLC, just me, my laptop, and a business plan that fit on 2 pages. It was time to show the world what I could really build. I spent the winter quietly testing Onimo with 5 carefully selected beta clients, small businesses that needed robust software but couldn't afford enterprise-level solutions. I offered them free pilots in exchange for detailed feedback. The results exceeded my expectations. Onimo handled everything I threw at it while using half the server resources of comparable systems. The elegant architecture I dreamed about at Salvanta was finally working in the real world. One of my beta clients was particularly interesting, a logistics company that had recently dropped their contract with Salvanta due to reliability issues. They switched to Onimo without realizing I was the original architect of the system they'd abandoned. "This is incredible," their CTO told me during a video call. "We're seeing better performance than we ever got from our previous vendor." I smiled and thanked him for the feedback, not mentioning that I'd basically rebuilt their old system from the ground up, just better. By spring, word was starting to spread through tech circles about the mysterious new framework that was outperforming established players. Industry forums buzzed with speculation about who was behind North Leaf Systems. I remained carefully anonymous, communicating only through email and secure video calls where I kept my camera off. The first major trade publication article appeared in TechCrunch. Stealth startup North Leaf Systems gains traction with revolutionary architecture. The piece was mostly speculation, but it quoted several clients praising Onimo's performance and reliability. That afternoon, I received an inquiry through my website's contact form. The email signature made me laugh out loud. Damon Kittredge, independent technology consultant. He wanted a demo of Onimo for a potential client. His message was professionally written, with no hint that he knew who was behind North Leaf. I replied within the hour, "Thank you for your interest. Unfortunately, we're not accepting new consultants at this time. We prefer to work directly with end clients." 3 days later, he submitted another inquiry using a different email address and claiming to represent a startup in Austin. I declined that one too. The man who'd fired me at a soccer game was now begging for access to my new creation. The irony was delicious. I printed out both emails and pinned them to my workshop wall, right next to Benedict's letter. Sometimes the universe had a perfect sense of humor. The turning point came at the Northeast Tech Conference in Boston. I'd submitted a presentation about adaptive security frameworks, carefully avoiding any mention of my Salvanta history. The conference organizers had scheduled me for a smaller breakout session, but word spread quickly through the attendee chat groups. By the time I took the stage, the room was packed beyond capacity. I spoke for 30 minutes about the principles behind Onimo, demonstrating how elegant architecture could solve problems that brute force approaches couldn't touch. The audience was engaged and asked thoughtful questions. Afterward, a line of potential clients formed at the side of the stage, CTOs from Fortune 500 companies, government contractors, startup founders. Everyone wanted to know more about North Leaf Systems. That's when I saw him. Damon stood at the back of the room, his face pale with recognition. Our eyes met across the crowd and I watched his expression shift from confusion to shock to something that might have been fear. I finished my conversation with a potential client, gathered my materials, and walked directly toward him. "Hello, Damon," I said pleasantly. I hear you've been busy. Damon stammered something about coincidences and small worlds, but I could see the panic in his eyes. He was realizing that the person he dismissed as replaceable had just delivered one of the most talked about presentations at a major industry conference. I should congratulate you, I continued, keeping my voice friendly and professional. I read about your new consulting venture. How's that working out? He mumbled something about building his client base, avoiding eye contact. Well, best of luck with that, I said. The market can be quite competitive for people without a proven track record. I walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing there among the crowd of conference attendees. Several people had overheard our conversation and were now looking at him with curiosity. That evening, my phone exploded with interview requests. Word had spread that the mysterious founder of North Leaf Systems had finally shown her face. I declined them all, but the speculation online was intense. Within 48 hours, 3 more Svanta clients had reached out about switching to Onimo. The momentum was building faster than I'd anticipated. The next month brought a flood of new business. Companies that had been burned by Svanta's failures were eager to try something better. I was careful to vet each client thoroughly, ensuring they understood that North Leaf operated differently than traditional vendors. The biggest win came from an unexpected source. The same government contractor that had sued Svanta was now interested in Onimo. Their technical evaluation team was impressed by the framework's performance and security features. This is exactly what we needed, their project manager told me during our final negotiation call. Why didn't we know about you guys earlier? I simply smiled and said that sometimes the best solutions take time to mature. The contract was worth $8 million over 3 years, more than enough to hire a proper team and move North Leaf out of my barn workshop. That evening, I called my old colleague Sarah, who'd been laid off during Svanta's cost-cutting measures. How would you feel about joining a startup? I asked her. Her laughter was infectious. Camille, I was wondering when you'd resurface. Yes. Absolutely yes. Within 6 months, North had 15 employees working out of a renovated warehouse in Burlington's Tech District. Sarah had brought 2 other former Salve engineers, and I had recruited several talented developers from other companies. The culture was everything I'd dreamed of during those frustrating meetings at Salvanta. We focused on elegant solutions rather than rushed features. We documented everything properly. We treated each other with respect. Most importantly, we built software that actually worked. The industry recognition came quickly. Anima won awards for innovation and reliability. Tech blogs wrote about our human-centered approach to enterprise software. Venture capital firms started reaching out, though I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. The best moment came when Forbes published their annual list of companies to watch, and North Leaf made the top 10. I framed the article and hung it in our break room, right next to a photo of our team at a local hiking trail. We looked happy, relaxed, and proud of what we were building together. Benedict would have loved seeing what grew from the seeds he'd planted with that legal document. The final blow to Salvanta came 18 months after I'd left. Their remaining major client, a financial services company, terminated their contract and signed with North Leaf instead. The news article was brutal. Salvanta Technologies faces potential bankruptcy as final major client departs. The company that had once been worth over $00 million was now struggling to pay basic operating expenses. I felt a complex mix of emotions reading the story, satisfaction certainly, but also sadness for the good people still trapped there. Many of the engineers I'd worked with were talented developers who deserved better leadership. That afternoon, I posted a job opening on our website, Experienced Software Engineers Wanted. Values-driven team. Building the future of enterprise software. Within a week, I had applications from 12 former Salve. I hired 8 of them. The team that had once built my framework was now reunited, working on something even better. The circle was complete, but it was bigger and stronger than before. During our first all-hands meeting, Sarah raised her hand. Should we send a thank you card to Damon? This never would have happened if he hadn't fired you. The room erupted in laughter. 2 years after that soccer game, I received an unexpected email. Damon was requesting a meeting, not as a potential client or consultant, but as a job applicant. His message was carefully written, acknowledging his previous management mistakes and expressing interest in contributing to North's mission. He attached a resume that was mostly empty after Solvanta, consulting gigs that had lasted weeks rather than months. I discussed it with my leadership team. Sarah was opposed. Why would we hire someone who treated people so badly? Others were curious about his technical skills, though his recent work history wasn't impressive. I decided to take the meeting, mostly out of curiosity. Damon arrived at our office looking older and humbler than I remembered. His expensive suit was gone, replaced by business casual that looked like it came from a department store. We sat in my conference room, which had a beautiful view of Lake Champlain. I made mistakes, he began. Big ones. I let politics cloud my judgment about people and technology. I listened without interrupting, letting him fill the silence. I know you have every reason to say no, he continued, but I've learned from what happened. I want to build things the right way. When Damon finished his pitch, I leaned back in my chair and considered my response. Through the conference room windows, I could see my team working in the open workspace, collaborating, laughing, solving complex problems together. I appreciate you coming in, I said finally, and I'm glad you've had time to reflect on what happened at Solvanta. His face brightened with hope. However, I continued, North only hires builders. People who create value through their technical skills and collaborative spirit. We don't recycle what's broken. The hope faded from his eyes. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a brochure. There's an excellent technical retraining program at the community college. If you're serious about building things the right way, I'd suggest starting there. Damon stared at the brochure for a long moment, then quietly thanked me and left. I watched from my window as he walked to his car, a modest sedan rather than the BMW he'd driven at Solvanta. Part of me felt sympathy for his fall. But a larger part remembered the casual cruelty of that soccer game firing. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way. 3 years after my unceremonious departure from Solvanta, North Systems employed 47 people and served clients across 3 continents. We'd grown organically, without venture capital, building exactly the kind of company Benedict had envisioned. The final validation came when MIT invited me to speak at their annual technology symposium. The auditorium was packed with students, professors, and industry leaders. I spoke about ethical software development and the importance of putting people before profits. During the Q&A session, a student asked about dealing with workplace adversity. Sometimes, I said, the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for the best thing you'll ever build. The key is maintaining your integrity while you figure out what comes next. After the talk, a reporter approached me. She was writing a feature about successful entrepreneurs who'd been underestimated by their previous employers. Any regrets about how things ended at Solvanta? She asked. I thought about Benedict's letter, about those lonely nights coding in my barn workshop, about watching my team grow into something special. No regrets, I said. Every step led me exactly where I needed to be. The final chapter of the Svant story arrived in my inbox on a quiet Thursday morning, a news alert, Svant Technologies assets acquired in bankruptcy sale. The company that had fired me at a soccer game no longer existed. Their intellectual property had been sold to a private equity firm that would probably strip it for parts and sell the pieces to larger companies. I thought about calling some of my former colleagues to see how they were handling the news but realized I didn't need to. Most of the talented people had already found new homes, many of them at North. That afternoon, I drove to Burlington's Lakeview Cemetery. Benedict's grave was in a peaceful section overlooking the lake, marked by a simple granite stone that bore his name and the inscription, Builder of Dreams. I placed a small object on his headstone, a circuit board containing the first Anemo chip we'd manufactured. It seemed like the right memorial for someone who'd spent his life creating technology that made people's lives better. "We did it clean," I said quietly. "We did it right. And we won." The afternoon sun sparkled on the lake below, and I could hear the distant laughter of children playing in the nearby park. 6 months later, I received a letter that changed everything. The envelope bore the seal of the United States government, specifically, the Department of Homeland Security. Inside was an invitation to bid on a massive infrastructure project, implementing secure communication systems across all federal agencies. The project was worth over $2 billion and would take 5 years to complete. The letter specifically mentioned Northwaf's reputation for ethical development practices and our proven track record of reliable, secure systems. I called Sarah into my office and showed her the letter. "Holy," she said, then immediately apologized for swearing. "No," I laughed, "that's exactly the right response." We spent the next week discussing whether to pursue such a massive opportunity. It would mean growing the company exponentially, hiring hundreds of people, and taking on responsibilities we'd never imagined. But it also meant proving that companies built on ethical principles could compete at the highest levels. We decided to submit our proposal. The government proposal process took 8 months. Teams of evaluators visited our offices, interviewed our employees, and tested our technology against impossible scenarios. Throughout it all, I kept thinking about that soccer game where Damon had casually destroyed my career. If someone had told me that day that I'd eventually be competing for one of the largest technology contracts in government history, I would have thought they were insane. The notification came on a Friday afternoon, a simple email with the subject line, "Contract Award Notification." We'd won. The celebration that evening was unlike anything we'd ever experienced. The entire team gathered at a local restaurant overlooking Lake Champlain. We toasted Benedict's memory, our clients who'd believed in us, and the long journey that had brought us to this moment. Sarah stood up to make a speech. 3 years ago, Camille got fired from a company that didn't deserve her. Tonight, we're celebrating the biggest contract win in Vermont's tech history. Sometimes the universe has perfect timing. Everyone raised their glasses. Through the restaurant windows, I could see the lake stretching toward the mountains, peaceful and eternal. 1 year later, Forbes published a cover story about North Leaf Systems, the ethical tech company that's changing government infrastructure. The article detailed our journey from a one-person barn startup to a major government contractor employing over 300 people. The reporter had done her research, uncovering the Salvanta connection and painting the story as a modern David and Goliath tale. She'd even tracked down Damon for comment, though he declined to be interviewed. The magazine arrived at my office on the same day I received another piece of mail, a handwritten letter from Benedict's widow, Marie. "Benedict always said you were special," she wrote. "He would be so proud of what you've built. The legal document he left you wasn't just about protecting your code. It was about protecting your future. He saw your potential even when you couldn't see it yourself." I sat in my office holding the letter and looking out at our bustling workspace. Engineers collaborated on whiteboards. Project managers coordinated with clients. And everyone seemed genuinely happy to be here. My phone buzzed with a calendar reminder, team hike, Mount Mansfield. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door. Outside, the Vermont mountains waited under an endless blue sky, and my team was loading into cars for an afternoon adventure. The best revenge, I'd learned, wasn't destroying your enemies. It was building something so beautiful that their betrayal became irrelevant.